Talk of Zack Snyder film, you gotta understand that they're just massive amounts of Easter eggs to the comics and to movies and so many other things that have to do with DC. In this case, this Easter egg that's not talked much about in social media, though it has been talked some, not as detailed and deep as I'm about to go. So, in Justice League, Clark Kent carries Lois Lane to the Kent farm. And this is after he's trying to catch himself and he latches on to Lois, and she is able to bring him to his humanity, the humanity side of him. Now Lois comes back out of the house after they go inside the house, and when she comes outside the house, Clark is standing there. But his face is not facing her. He's away from her. Then he turns and he starts speaking to her. Now, this is a shout out in the symmetry of Zack Snyder's films. In the very first meeting of Clark and Lois, Lois was the one that wasn't facing Clark, looking away from him. She was looking at the grave of his father, Jonathan Kent. She then turns to Clark and starts asking him a ton of questions. Questions about his existence, who he is, and she wants to tell his story. Interestingly enough, here, Lois again asks those kinds of questions. She asks him this time, in the reporter's inquisitive way, how was it to come back? How does he feel? Etc. Now, what's interesting about this is that this instance here is not all to it. In fact, this is also a shout out, an Easter egg, to Superman 1978, where Superman's mother, Martha Kent, comes out and Superman is about to leave the Kent farm. He has bad news. And as you can see, he has his back turned to Martha as she's coming towards him. But he does turn towards her and starts to speak to her. Now, what's interesting about this is that this face-to-face conversation also happened in a very similar way with Lois and Clark in Justice League. When Clark turned and faced Lois, they again were eye to eye, face to face. Now, even more interesting is that this Easter egg also shouts out to not only Clark and Lois, but Clark and Martha. See, Clark started speaking to Martha about the bad news that he had to leave Kansas and go elsewhere, north. And he really was filled with a lot of emotion because Jonathan Kent had recently died. And so, in parting, he had to break the bad news to Martha, and they embraced very, very strongly and emotionally because he didn't know if he would see her again. Now, what's very interesting about that is that a scene of embrace also happened in Justice League, where Clark Kent embraces Lois Lane, telling her the opposite of that. This is the beauty of Zack Snyder's symmetry. He says, I was the fool that left, but I'll make it right. And they embrace. But even more so, he also embraces Martha Kent when she sees him, and she's glad that he's alive. Yet an inverse again to Superman 1978, because he was hugging his mother because he was going to leave. In this case, his mother's glad that he's alive. And they embrace Martha Kent with Clark. But that's not all. It's also a shout out to Man of Steel. Clark returns home and Martha is happy to see her son alive and happy and well. And they also embrace there. So it gets even more interesting as I get even more complicated as it even goes further. In Superman 1978, Clark embraces Martha Kent and he speaks to Martha. But also, this is a shout out to Lois Lane and Superman when Lois Lane goes to the cemetery and she sees Jonathan Kent's grave. And the discussion they have brings up Jonathan Kent because he died. And Superman explains why he's keeping himself secret. Hello, 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 hello. This conversation happens at the end of the death of Jonathan Kent, who in Superman 1978 dies of a heart attack. And so Superman has to leave the home because he's found his calling and what he must do. But Martha is still heartbroken at the loss of her husband. And now her son is leaving her too. She says, remember me. So the subject title here is Jonathan Kent's death in both cases. That's how much these Easter eggs are. That's Zack Snyder. Freak me out, Snyder. I gotta say, guys, I really enjoy breaking these things down because Zack is just that kind of dude. He pulls Easter eggs, and they are multiple Easter eggs for one action. You get a lot of value for one scene. That's Zack. Freak me out, Snyder. You guys have a great one.